talking about a topic that we're going to refer to as new imperialism. And we've talked about imperialism before. Imperialism is like when you conquer, it's when you take over, it's when you set up colonies. And there's been a couple of phases of that. For example, if you and I go back all the way to like the 15 and 1600s, what were the first two European countries that sailed, settled, colonized in the end of the 1400s and in the 1500s? Spain and Portugal, right? And they had their time in the sun, and that was cool and all that. But Spain and Portugal, they rose and then they fell. When we look at what we call new imperialism, we're looking at what's happening at the end of the 1800s and in the start of the 1900s. And there's a good image I want to show you that kind of highlights that. And it's a map on the screen in front of you. And this map on the screen in front of you is called Scramble for Africa. When you hear that term Scramble for Africa, think about what it's like on the day after Thanksgiving. What is that day called? Black Friday. And what do we traditionally do?
Shop.
You shop, right? And they have these things called doorbusters, which are like really good deals. Like they'll have 10 TVs that are like 30% off or something like that. And because there's a limited amount of these doorbusters, what are you going to do when they open those doors at whatever time? Yeah, you're gonna bust through. You're gonna knock down that grandma to get that TV, right? Like people fight, and it can be kind of ugly. They're scrambling for these limited amounts of objects, and so this image on the screen is called the Scramble for Africa because it shows you Africa 1870 and then Africa 1914, and they're actually very different. What you see. The reason for that is that when you look at the image, when you look at the screen, you'll notice a couple things. One thing you'll notice is that in 1870, if color represents conquest, is most of Africa conquered in 1870? No. And there's a reason why most of Africa is not conquered in 1870, and you actually know the reason. What was it that was keeping white Europeans, even though they had superior technology, from moving in and taking over? Yeah, and give me an example. Here's the example of malaria. It turns out that there is a disease. It's not like an infectious disease. Like if you get malaria, you can't sneeze and give it to someone. How do you get malaria? You get mosquitoes. So it turns out that other than the coastal parts of Africa, it turns out super dangerous, super deadly for white Europeans to try to live in Africa. And you have like a 90% chance of dying. And they didn't really understand what caused it or what the reason for it happening was. It was enough that kept white people out. But listen, there's something that Europe, and really Europe in a unique way, went through that the rest of the world went through later. Europe went through a scientific revolution. And what other revolution did Europe go through? Well, an enlightenment also. But also they went through the industrial revolution. And so there's a lot of changes Europe's gone through as they applied science. They were able to make electricity. They were able to have telegraphs, and they were able to have advances in steel and cotton and all that kind of great stuff. But they also had advances in chemistry. And they applied that to the pharmaceutical industry. And they didn't come up with a cure for malaria. They did come up with drugs that treated malaria. So you may have had like a 90% chance of dying. And then that 90% chance went down to like a 10% chance. And white Europeans said, that's worth it. It's worth it to go to Africa, make profit, make money. I only have a 10% chance of dying. So when you look at 1914, pretty much all of Africa is taken over on the map. Pretty much all of it is. And that's because of these medical advances. If you look at the map on the screen, 1914, there's a couple colors. Every color represents conquest. What are some of the colors that look like they make up most of Africa. What would you say this color is?
Brown.
I would say brown, right? I'd say brown. And it turns out that this is France. France takes over huge portions of Africa, and that's impressive, but what natural feature of Africa makes that less impressive when you think about what's there? What desert is that? Yeah, it's the Sahara Desert, right? There's another color that kind of sticks out on this map. It's green. If you look at green, there's a country that rules Egypt and Sudan and Kenya and Uganda, and a country labeled as Rhodesia. And this country, these areas also have a natural feature. In fact, what starts in Uganda and makes its way up through Sudan, through Egypt, and empties into the Mediterranean Sea? Nile River. So this green is actually Great Britain. And so the British own everything in green. They own Nigeria. They own all this territory. This is not surprising because for a while, France and Britain have been like the two powers that have been flexing their muscles the most. But on this map, there's actually 3 new kids on the block that I want to talk about. And what I mean by this is there's 2 countries that have never existed before, and they came together for the very first time in the 1800s. And now they're a new country. They want to do what all the other Europeans are doing. All the other Europeans have empire, so guess what these new countries want to have so they can be like all the cool kids? They want empire, right? So one of the countries is this country that has this yellowish orange. They control Somalia. They control Eritrea. They control Libya. And the country that's new that controls these parts of the world is actually Italy. There hasn't been an Italy before. Italy's been like fragmented and broken up. They're a country for like the first time at the end of the 1800s. And because they're a country for the first time, they want what all the other countries have. Everyone has empire. Well, we want empire. So the Italians, they take over Libya. The Italians take over Somalia, and the Italians take over Eritrea. To this day, if you and I go to Eritrea, the older generation speaks Italian. They have pasta as part of like the restaurant culture in Eritrea. There's a fancy word for Italian ice cream. I don't know if you know this word. It's called gelato. They sell gelato on the street corners of this African country called Eritrea. So that's Italy, new kid on the block. There's another new kid on the block, and they control this modern-day Tanzania. They control modern-day Namibia, and that's actually Germany. We've never talked about a quote-unquote Germany before. We've talked about something called the Holy Roman Empire. We've talked about a country called Prussia, but we've never talked about a quote-unquote Germany. They're a new kid on the block, and they want what everyone else has. They want empire, and so they get parts of the map. There's one last new kid on the block that we have literally never talked about, and they're the country that controls this huge part of Central Africa. You see the largest Central African country is this one. What is this called? The Congo. And according to the map, who controls the Congo? The Belgians. Now, I don't know if you know, but Belgium is like a really small country. Belgium is situated between France and Germany. Belgium's right over here, and it's probably as big as like the letter B in Belgian Congo. And Belgian Congo is actually super duper 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 massive. The Belgian Congo, and the Belgian Congo has a lot of natural resources. We've actually talked about the Belgian Congo already this semester. What do we get, all of us in this room, from the Congo, and it's in our pockets or our desk right now?
Cobalt.
Cobalt, which is used for our cell phone batteries. And what's the bummer about cobalt production? Yeah, they use slaves to make it. Now that's terrible, and we can like watch the video and feel bad, but we're probably not going to change our behavior because It's just, well, it's just how it is, People knew sugar was made through slave labor, but people are like, yeah, that's terrible, but I'm not going to stop eating sugar. So the Belgian Congo, we know about Congo today, but back then there was also something important. It wasn't cobalt though. It was something else that Europe wanted, especially after the Industrial Revolution. We can make tires out of this. We can make industrial hoses out of this. It turns out that there is a plant, a tree, that makes rubber. And that when you cut it, like the sap that leaks out is where we get rubber from. And that was like really important. And the best place in the world to get rubber was from the Belgian Congo. And spoiler alert, guess what kind of labor they used to get what kind? Yeah, they used slave labor. So sadly for the Congo, in some ways, nothing's changed in 100 years. 100 plus years ago, the Congo was being abused by outsiders for natural resources using slave labor, and today the Congo is being abused by outside labor, by outside forces using slave labor. So not a lot's changed. I'll show you this next image. This next image is an empire. And this empire on the map on the screen at one point controlled everything in red on the map. Now, it doesn't mean that they controlled it at the end of the 1800s. For example, this red dot is modern day New York. They don't own New York. Obviously that's part of the United States, but they did at first. In fact, they're the ones who started New York City. This group of people famously got involved off the coast of Brazil in the sugar trade. This group of people famously started white colonists in South Africa. This group of people thought that modern day Indonesia was the crown jewel of their empire due to the spices. And these people even made it into Japan and even into parts of China because their people were known to be culturally willing to respect traditions that were different than their own. What empire is this in red? That's the Dutch, right? And so we've talked about the Dutch. What was that Dutch company that the good old VOC, the Dutch East India Company. So we've mentioned the Dutch before, and that's a widespread empire, but is this a massive empire? No. I mean, Indonesia is bigger than the Netherlands, but this is not like a massive empire, though they are quite wealthy. Who controls everything in blue on this map? It's like a third of Africa. Spain? They speak Spanish in a third of Africa? They do not speak a third. Well, what part of this is Britain? Question mark? Question mark? We did. It's France. So, in case you don't know on a map, this is France right here. And France took over all of this part of Africa. So, if you guys are in French right now, the biggest place where they speak French is not France, but Africa. There are more French speakers in Africa than they are in France. In fact, the biggest French-speaking city in the world is the capital of Congo, not Paris. More people speak French in Africa than speak it in France. So they have everything in blue, which is impressive. They have a little piece of South America. They have Madagascar. And what country is this in Asia? This is a country that will be important to the Americans in the 1960s. It is Vietnam. So that's a pretty good looking empire. Who controls everything in pink? That's the British. And of all the empires, I can think we can agree this is the biggest, this is the largest one. The British control all of Canada. In fact, to this day, Queen Elizabeth is still the Queen of Canada. She's on their money still. To this day, Queen Elizabeth is the Queen of the Bahamas. She's on their money on the Bahamas. There's a part of Central America which is called Belize, and they don't speak Spanish in this part of Central America. They speak English. They speak English in this part of South America, Guyana. They also speak English, as I mentioned, in like a third of Africa, which is incredible. India and Pakistan speak English. And what whole continent do they conquer and take over? Australia. So we're going to focus our time today talking about the British in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So take a look at your handout. One of the things that the British want to do is they want to establish a port city. And I want to show you on the map where this city is. And I want you to tell me why this would be an important thing. So I'm going to show you on the map where this is, and I want you to tell me why this would be important. So right here, there's a body of water. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little body of water right here. We've studied this before. It's called the Strait of Malacca. That's right. And when you look at it, that Strait of Malacca, it's really great because it is a through. If I want to go from one major part of the world to the other, what two parts of the world are going to be connected by the Strait of Malacca? What two parts? If I am controlling this body of water, what India's here, so check, check, and check. What other major, so if I'm going through India, no major. Like we've never talked about Australia, so it's not going to be on our list. But I'm going from India, I'm going to sail through the Strait of Malacca. What is the most important thing on this side? China, right? So for sure. And there's a city that the British put right there on the Strait of Malacca. And that's such a good call because that little strait of water is so small. If I can control that, I control trade for like the two most important economies on the planet. What city do they put there according to this map? Singapore. And that's what we're going to write down in the first blank, that the British established a free port city of Singapore. We'll write that down on our first blank. And the second line on the handout, it says that this was a center of trade between what two parts that we've identified? India and China. Let's talk about China for a second. It's important that we do that. When we talked about China, there was an online assignment that sadly many did not do, but it's important that we talk about it. It turns out that the British have been really interested in China for a while, and that's not crazy because China has a whole lot of people. And if I could just figure out one thing to sell to the people of China, I can make a lot of money. And the British, they do find something that they sell to the Chinese. What is it that the British sell to the Chinese that makes them a ridiculous amount of money, even though this is something the Chinese don't want? Opium. So opium, FYI, is a major drug. We get heroin from opium, and you smoke it, and this thing like lays you out. Like you do inject heroin, you don't inject opium, you smoke it. Heroin comes from the same source. You smoke opium and it lays you out. So it's highly addictive, and once you get hooked on opium, all you want to do is get more and keep smoking it. So worse than nicotine, like this destroys your life. So the Chinese, they eventually tell Great Britain no. The Chinese tell the British, you can't sell this drug to us anymore. And the Chinese actually start to collect the opium and burn the opium, and they start like a war on drugs. The British don't like this though. In fact, the British get really upset because that's my money. And what did the British decide to do as the Chinese start enforcing their drug laws? They declare war. So what happens is Great Britain invades China and says, how dare you guys say no to drugs? And the British invade China, and they actually tell China, we're going to war with you because you started it, which is crazy. The only thing China did was like enforce their own drug laws. This conflict has an easy name to remember because this war is about opium. Guess what it's called? The Opium War. And the British, if you are to do a comparison, here's the British. Is this the biggest country in the world? No, it's kind of like small and tiny. Here's China. It's one of the longest running, largest countries on the planet. Who should probably win this fight? China. But China's made a mistake. China never decided to modernize. They never had, like England, an industrial revolution. They never had, like England, a scientific revolution. And so, in the Opium War, the British bring like semi-automatic guns, and some of the Chinese armies have like spears and bows and arrows. And I'm sure they're brave. I'm sure they're like really good at those spears. But if your army has like 1,000 guys with spears, I have 100 guys with a machine gun, it's not going to be even a close contest. So the British humiliate the Chinese. They win the war, and they continue to push drugs on the Chinese. And then to add humiliation to the defeat, they actually send the Chinese a bill and say, this is how much you owe us for forcing us to invade you, for us to be pushing our drugs on you. And the Chinese had no choice but to accept. And they had to pay up, humiliating. So the British are really flexing their muscles. It says on the third line, the British also quickly expanded to this Southeast Asian nation that emerged as a powerful kingdom after 1750. It's this country which is on this map right to the east of India. What's to the east of India? Burma. We're going to write down Burma. It says on your handout, the French moved into this area after 1895. We've identified this part of Asia where the French were. We know it's Vietnam, but there's another word for this part of Asia at the time. It's on the board. They called it Indochina, which was their word for this whole region of Vietnam. That's what you'll write down where it says the French moved to this area after 1895, Indochina, Indochina. That's another term for this part of the world that we refer to as Vietnam. It was called Indochina, and the French take that over. That's why to this day, if you have someone that you know who's Vietnamese, if they're not Buddhist, they're probably Catholic, because that's the religion the French brought over with them. So there are thousands of Catholic Vietnamese to this day. Below that, the Dutch also get involved with Asia. We mentioned them moments ago, and they have primarily everything in this red. This is called the Dutch East Indies. This is modern-day Indonesia. And there's something that really brought them to this part of the world, and it made them a ridiculous amount of money. It says on the handout that the Dutch East Indies, the Dutch fought a war against native Muslim forces over the lucrative, you'll write down, spice trade. Spice was the thing that started it all. It was what made white people leave Europe for the first time. Spice is what made Chris Columbus willing to sail the ocean blue in 1492. And the Dutch find these islands are where the pepper and um, the rare spices they didn't have. This is where these spices were from, and so these islands were worth beating up local Muslims over to make sure they could. So I want to now talk about Australia. So when you take a look at Australia, it's about as far from the British homeland as possible. The British homeland is here, and this is way down here. In fact, they call it Down Under. Is like a nickname for Australia because it's way down there on the map, and also is New Zealand as well. And on the handout where it says Australia, it says there was an English captain, the first guy to sail and to explore was a guy. You'll write his name on the blank. His name was James Cook. Like you're making something, you cook something. James Cook was his name. And he explored New Zealand and Australia from 1769 to 1778. And that's a really good time to explore this continent because what are the British going to lose in the 1770s? Yeah, the 13 colonies, right? So Australia is going to be like their, rebound relationship. Like you break up with someone and then you kind of like are looking for someone to replace, and that's Australia. They're kind of a rebound relationship. Now, it says on the handout what made the native populations of Australia and New Zealand vulnerable. Two things. First of all, if you look at Australia, is it next to other major civilizations? No. What is bad if you're out on your own biologically as a human? What's bad for your group of people if you've never been around other humans? Why would that be a bad thing?
Because if people come around you, you're going to get
If people come around you, you'll get the sickness and die. Can you give me another example where that has already happened?
in Europe, in Africa.
No.
It didn't happen.
In Latin America? With who? Native Americans got sick from who? Through what disease? Smallpox, right? It turns out that North and South America were isolated for thousands of years. They came over from Russia over a land bridge, but that land bridge went away. It didn't melt. Ice melted, and so sea levels rose, and what used to be a land bridge is now underwater, and Native Americans got stuck. They got stranded in North and South America, which is not a problem until white people show up from Europe, and they brought diseases that they had never seen before. And because they never seen it before, their body had no natural defense. 90% of Native Americans died. Australia is the exact same way. Australia is isolated. They're out there. They have no exposure to diseases, and so they don't see this kind of death. It's a big deal. If you compare that with Africa, when white people show up to Africa, there's no disease white people give to Africa they've never had, because Africa has been already involved in global trade by two different ways. We've talked about something called the Indian Ocean Trade Network. People from India and Africa are going back and forth for 1,000 years. We talk about something called the Trans-Saharan Trade Route. People are going from North Africa to Sub-Saharan Africa for 1,000 years, spreading goods, ideas, and even disease. But Australia is going to be different. And so the first thing we're going to write down where it says, what made native populations of Australia and New Zealand vulnerable? You'll write down disease. They're isolated. They're on their own. So disease. There's a second thing that you're going to struggle with. If you are on your own, what else will you not have a lot of? Because you don't have other people to get it from, to inspire you, or to trade with. You're going to write down technology. A lot of times we get technology because we see another country, another person, another culture has something, and we want that. and we say, hey, I'm super interested in that too, but no one is in the neighborhood of Australia. They're on their own. So when the Europeans show up with like guns and machine guns, early types, the Australians have like sticks, and they're still in the Stone Age, incapable of like making metal. Australia. Two things that put them at a disadvantage: disease and lack of technology. Well, let's talk about the native people of New Zealand. There are native people of New Zealand. So here's Australia. New Zealand's off the coast. And New Zealand is super pretty country. In fact, if you're a nerd and you watched like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it was filmed in New Zealand. I just saw that Amazon is going to start a TV series, Lord of the Rings TV series, and season 1 is going to cost $500 million, which is the most expensive TV series of all time. That's season 1 will cost $500 million. They're filming it in New Zealand. And it turns out New Zealand, right here, had people living there already. And these are what the native people of New Zealand look like. These native people of New Zealand, they have, face tattoos and things of this nature. They're this brown-skinned people. And there's a name for these natives of New Zealand. They're called the Maori. And it's spelled M-A-O-R-I. We're going to write that in the blank. Now, looking at the Maori, M-A-O-R-I, what group of people do they physically look similar to that we've already studied, known to be like the best sailors in the ancient world? The Polynesians. Remember that there's all these islands that are been settled. And the people who live on these islands are Polynesian people. Like if you saw the Disney Moana movie, it's all about the Polynesians. And these people here that are the natives of New Zealand, they're the Maori. They are related to these Polynesian people. But the bummer about the Maori, they don't have exposure to white European diseases. The bummer about the Maori, they don't have guns. So when white Europeans show up with both gun and disease, you can imagine what's going to happen to the Maori people. It says on the handout their population was 250,000. After white Europeans, it goes down to 42,000. There's also natives of Australia. Some pictures of the natives of Australia. These are some native children. They are dark brown-skinned people. And there's variation in how the natives of Australia look. Now, they are darker people, right? Now, some of them, if you were to look at them, you're not looking at them and thinking probably they look Polynesian. But what other part of the world might you say there's some similarity to? Africa, right? There are some common features among some of them, but there is some diversity because you wouldn't necessarily look at these children and say, oh, like they have African features at all. That kid on the left's just smiling, right? So these, what are the name of the natives of Australia? What are they called? What are they called? No. The natives of Australia. So they're called the Aborigines. I'll spell that for you if you don't know. It's A-B-O-R-I-G-I-N-E-S. The Aborigines. And so they're the native people there. But bummer for these Aborigines, they don't have diseases that white Europeans have, so many of them die. They don't have technology that white Europeans have, so many of them die. In fact, looking at the handout, 650,000 of them lived there originally. It goes down to 42,000. Goes down to 42.
Well, technically, the Maori put up a better fight than the
The Maori, well, I mean, I think part of it also is more people go to Australia than New Zealand. So there's more contact with white people in Australia. And that leads us to the next line. Who were the first permanent British settlers in Australia? Who were the first types of people, white people, to make it to Australia? What was the purpose of Australia originally? It was a prison. So it turns out, like, if you owed money and you couldn't pay back, like, your debt, you went to what was called debtor's prison. And it was sadly a bad part of capitalism that some people made money and other people got in debt. If you've ever seen, you know that story, The Christmas Carol with Ebenezer Scrooge? Who's the guy who wrote that famous short story?
What's his name, Trevor?
A C. Charles Dickens. So Charles Dickens, super famous author, and he writes this book, Christmas Carol, which is about wealth and poverty, and these are things because he himself, he grew up with his parents being arrested, sent to debtor's prison, and Charles Dickens, as a child, actually had to work in a sweatshop because of his parents' credit problems. Now, if you didn't work in a sweatshop to pay off your parents' credit debt at age 8, 9, 10, your parents were sent to Australia. The whole island was a prison because even if you break out of jail, what do you have around you?
The Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, like ocean, right? Like you broke out of jail, congratulations, you're going nowhere. Because I don't know if you know, but like Australia has like the most dangerous animals in the world that are there, and an ocean. So it says on the handout, who were the first permanent settlers of Australia? You'll write down convicts. Convicts were. But even though convicts or prisoners were the first white people who made it to Australia, there was something that happened. It says, what did the discovery of gold bring to Australia? As soon as they find out there's gold there, I'm not going to just send prisoners there anymore. In fact, we're going to write down on this line, free Europeans. Thousands and thousands of free white people start showing up because if you can find gold, you can find money, and that's transformational. Last line, and then we're going to close for the day. In 1860, the number of immigrants, the number of white Europeans that made it to Australia, you'll write down, was 1 million. That is incredible. And then we're going to see Australia in some ways is like the United States. Because what happened to our Native American population? We killed them off. We took their land. We forced them into reservations. And you know what the white majority of Australia did to the native people, the Aborigines? They took their land, they killed them off, and they forced them into certain areas. So we are going to go ahead and stop there. We're going to continue this tomorrow.